Hello. Last Thursday, a new play by David Hare opened at the National Theatre in London. David Hare is one of a generation of playwrights, including Howard Brenton, Snoo Wilson and David Edgar, who began writing for fringe theatre groups after leaving university at the end of the 1960s. 15 years later, their plays are seen on the stages of the big subsidised theatres like the National and the Royal Shakespeare. They've come in from the fringe, but yet they still see themselves as lying outside the establishment. They all write political plays with a bias in favour of the politics of the left. Hare's new play is called A Map of the World, and it marks a shift in interest in his writing. Until now, most of his plays have been concerned with what he sees as the political and moral decline of post-war Britain. But A Map of the World is an attempt, in his own words, to shift the agenda. The play is set in a luxury hotel in Bombay, where, ironically, a UNESCO conference on poverty is taking place. Stephen, a radical young English journalist, comes up against Mehta, a successful Indian novelist now living in England, who's been invited to speak at the conference.
The revenge of the old, all the time. The history of the world is the revenge of the old, as they paint themselves into corners, loveless, removed, relieved occasionally in hotel rooms by the visits of strange women who come to tell them that, yes, they are doing well, and yes, they may now take their revenge on those of us who are still young. People, countries, it's the same thing. The world now full of young countries trying imperfect, unwieldy new systems of ordering their affairs, watched by the old, who are praying that they do not succeed.
That was an extract from A Map of the World recorded in the early stages of rehearsal at the National Theatre. Later in the programme, I'll be talking to David Hare. But first we're going to look at his career, a career matched and echoed by several of his contemporaries, some of whom we've asked to talk about his work. After leaving Cambridge in 1968, where he acted and directed, David Hare worked briefly for Pathé Films before setting up with Tony Beaker one of the first fringe theatre touring groups. It was called Portable Theatre, and it began as an alternative to the kind of plays the Royal Court Theatre in London was interested in at the time. One of the portable playwrights was Howard Brenton.
The plays, at the time at the court, there was a brilliant generation of naturalistic writers led by David Storey and mounted by Lindsay Anderson. And with that school of writing, we had many differences. And they quite rightly were occupying a good stage and wouldn't, for a moment, let us onto it. And so David had the very brilliant, simple, creative idea of making a theatre and making virtue out of poverty and minimal means, and blasting it round the country. We were concerned to bust the theatre wide open, to cut aside naturalism and any received idea of what you should or should not do on a stage, and be dictated by what we saw, what we thought, believed in, what our experience was.
Slag, Hare's first full-length play, was produced in 1970, not by Portable, but at the Hampstead Theatre Club. The play describes how three women teachers at a girls' boarding school attempt to cut themselves off from the world and live without men. In Slag, Hare displayed an interest in writing about women which has characterized much of his later work. He talked about the play at the time it was first produced.
It's impossible to say in one simple way what I'm trying to do in the play. That's to say, the idea has always been that it should work on many levels. But specifically, it's concerned with one person's, the failure of their idealism. That's to say, this girl sets out with the idea that she can create a society of women who live on their own and who have no truck with men at all, i.e. she's trying to set up an alternative society. But A, she's doing it in a false situation, and B, she hasn't the slightest idea how to do it, so the attempt is more or less doomed.
Oh, my suffering! I shall crop my hair like Joan of Arc. Dreher, 1926. Extravagant gesture. While you're in there, Joanne, listen. The world is not divided into two, the good and the bad, the women and the men. Do you understand that? Do you understand? I don't believe it. No! Can you hear me? Do you feel feel better. You've caused a lot of trouble with your views. Now, let's get this straight. I am a woman and I'm inferior to men. My place is below, beneath and under men.
It's not! No!
I will fight to the death for my right to be inferior. Inferiority is a privilege I wish to preserve. I don't want to be equal. I don't want my girls equal. I don't want a socialist community.
Now it comes out!
Do you see what I want? Do you see what I want?
Oh, leave her alone.
I'm losing my pupils, my governors, my school, my flat.
Oh, leave her alone. Let's go for a drink.
When I was first asked to play Slag at the Royal Court, which was the second production, I turned it down. I must say in those days I was very timid and I was nurtured in what is known as the safety of the West End Theatre. So to go to the Left Wing Theatre at the Royal Court, I turned it down. I found the dialogue rather fruity, racy, and the demands of playing a rather dykey headmistress and stripping scenes in it, I turned it down, but I was persuaded by David and Max Stafford Clark, who directed it, to read it again, and indeed I did, and I said yes, and I am eternally grateful for the fact. In a way, it was a very, very happy time, and it seemed the Left Wing Theatre was rather more West Endy than the West End Theatre, because after the first run-through, David pranced down the stalls with a bottle of champagne, which was something I'd never had before, so it was very, very welcoming.
The Great Exhibition, which followed Slag in 1972, was a play about the disillusionment of a Labour MP. It pointed at what was to be another of Hare's preoccupations, the correlation between the professional and private morality of Britain's ruling classes. The Great Exhibition was directed by Richard Hare.
A lot of people think when they first meet David that he belongs to the upper middle class, or, you know, that he's moneyed and landed, or that he's patrician. He's not at all. It comes from what it seems unkind to describe as a humble background. It's a lower middle class background. He was born and brought up in, of all places, Bexhill-on-Sea, which is not a place that people would be inclined to associate David with. People think of him as the archetypal metropolitan man. But I think it's very important to know that about David, and know that his background is an important leverage for his view of the world. He's always felt like a child standing on tiptoe, looking over the wall. He was sent to a boarding school, a public school, because his father was a whaler in the Merchant Navy, and I think always felt disenfranchised there, always felt that he was a spectator rather than part of the tribe. And that's passionately informed his view and his critique of the middle and upper middle class and the upper class.
Knuckle in 1974 was the first of Hare's plays in which the actress Kate Nelligan appeared. It was a thriller about the seductive appeal of big money. Its production in a West End theatre represented one of the first attempts by his generation to find a wider audience for their type of political theatre. Hare's next, most political play was Fan Chen, written in 1975 for Joint Stock. Joint Stock's plays are a result of a collaboration between writer, director and the cast. Fan Chen was based on a book by the American writer William Hinton, which describes in great detail how change came to a remote Chinese village after the revolution.
In Lucheng County, there is a people's government. Our duty, the duty of all village leaders, is to consolidate the successes of the anti-traitor movement. The history of China is a history of violent and bloody rebellion, but always the blood runs down the gutter and nothing is changed. How are we to make sure that this time, in this tight circle, the overturning holds? The answer is, this time we think. We ask questions. We analyze.
But David to be handed this book about the Chinese revolution was an opportunity, I think, to demonstrate his political awareness and commitment and concern. And in a sense, it's more powerful for being removed from the immediate ambience of contemporary Britain.
Fan Chen raised doubts with some critics about Hare's writing. The characters sometimes seemed in danger of getting lost under the welter of political argument he'd made them bear. And his espousal of left-wing ideals seemed somewhat naive, particularly when some of the more brutal consequences of the Chinese Revolution became known here. His next play, Teeth and Smiles, starred Helen Mirren as a self-destructive rock singer and dealt with Hare's generation's sense of despair at the lack of change in British society. This was followed by Licking Hitler, a film for television in which she began to explore post-war society by writing about people's experiences of the war itself. It was largely inspired, as were a number of other plays at the time, by this book, The People's War by Angus Calder.
I can't remember whether I gave Angus Calder's The People's War to David Hare, or whether David had read it when we first started to talk about it. But it became the most important source work for Brassneck, Howard Brenton's The Churchill play, David Hare's Licking Hitler, Ian McEwan's The Imitation Game, Trevor Griffiths' Country. All those plays were, I'm not saying they were derived in any sense directly from the book, but the information in the book provided historical, factual corroboration for presenting an alternative view of the past to the view of the past that we had received as the truth of the generation before us.
Both in Licking Hitler and in Plenty, the play which followed it and which was done at the National Theatre, David is very concerned with the Second World War. I think in it he sees a particularly intense experience for the nation as a whole. I think he would regard it as one has a sense of it as an honourable war. It's an anti-fascist war, a war that created a huge desire for the democratisation of Britain. Really a time at which the nation began to understand a lot more about itself.
Anna Seton is an upper-class girl posted to a unit broadcasting black propaganda to Germany. In this excerpt, she submits to the violent advances of Archie MacLean, a brilliant working-class Scot writing for the unit.
Woman! I'm at your feet. Scotsman's approach to the art of love-making. The Scot makes love with a broken bottle and a great deal of screaming. There'll be a moment when I take off my clothes.
I literally didn't know there was such a thing as an electricity bill. I was sheltered, I suppose. Where we live, we just always left the lights on. I assumed the electricity came. Just came. Paid your taxes and you got your light. And then the other day I was talking to Eileen and she said to me that electricity prices had risen. And I said, what do you mean you have to pay? For what you use, you have to pay. Gas, electricity, water. Never occurred to me.
David was criticised at the time for suggesting, really, that in a rape could out of a rape could develop a love relationship. But what is crucial is that David will not point up for you that rape is bad, or that relationships that grow out of them are suspect, or that it is morally reprehensible to even suggest that they can. As a moralist, he always likes to leave things very open.
Licking Hitler and Plenty can be seen as companion pieces. They're both concerned with betrayal. Betrayal in a very specific, emotional, personal sense, and betrayal in a public sense, and political betrayal, to do with David's passionately felt belief that the legacy of 1945 has been totally betrayed, and that there is a generation that has been tainted by hypocrisy. And I think there's a line in Licking Hitler, where at the end of Licking Hitler, where she talks about the process, the constant habit of lying.
Over the years, I have been watching the steady impoverishment of people's ideals, their loss of faith, the lying, the daily inveterate lying, the 30-year-old deep corrosive national habit of lying, and I have remembered you. I have remembered the one lie you told to make me go away.
Whereas Anna's had a bad war, Susan Traherne in Plenty had a good war. She operated successfully behind the lines in occupied France. But she never finds in peacetime the sense of common purpose she knew during the war, and afterwards it comes to obsess her.
There's a strong sense of decline of the country, which again is charted through a kind of spiral into madness in the character herself. How she destroys everyone around her has maybe some kind of parallel with the way we are in some sense destroyed by a kind of society which for David doesn't have enough moral direction. And again, that point of moral direction, the point at which we did have those moral certitudes and a clear moral mission, was the last war.
In post-war Belgium, Susan Traherne talks to a British diplomat about the sudden death of her lover.
Had you been married long?
We met during the war.
I did notice some marks on the body.
Tony was a wireless operator with SOE. Our job was harassment behind the enemy lines. Very successful in Holland and Denmark. Less so in France. Tony was in a circuit that the Gestapo destroyed, then scattered. Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, Saarbrücken, Dachau. Some were tortured, some executed.
What did you do?
I was a courier. I was never caught. I wasn't his wife.
No.
Had you realized that?
I thought it possible.
What about the ambassador? Did he realize?
Lord, no. It would never occur to him.
Motoring together, it was just easier to say we were man and wife. In fact, I was barely even his mistress. He simply rang me a few weeks ago and asked me whether I'd like a holiday abroad. I was amazed. See, people in our organization didn't know each other all that well. You made it your business to know as little as possible. It was a point of principle. Even today, you don't know who most of your colleagues were.
The character of Susan in Plenty, for me personally, I disliked her. She did at moments irritate me. I also was extremely sorry for her. And at the end, as I say, I came up feeling very sympathetic, but she had annoyed me. I found her at moments extremely obsessive and self-indulgent, and you really just wanted to shake her. But I don't think there is a character, a woman in any of his plays that I have not sympathized with. There have been ones that I have not liked, who have irritated me, but I have always understood the woman at the end very, very fully.
There is a very self-destructive element in David's women. This is so in his later television film, Dreams of Leaving, and I think most starkly so in that film, where a young man comes to London, meets a very beautiful and elusive character, Caroline, who seems to drift through all the fashionable jobs available in what's really considered, I suppose, a sort of extension of the 60s. But never quite manages to either get into bed with her or even to remotely understand her.
You have that look. I really can't kiss you when you have that look. It freezes me up.
What sort of look?
The look that says, help me. I'm sorry. I can't.
Caroline, come on, this is stupid. How can you do this? It's just mad. I mean, for God's sake, you said you'd come home with me. Then when we get here, you simply freak out. I mean, for God's sake, do you think about my feelings? I mean, Jesus Christ, will you give me a break?
No. Stupid. I'm very frightened.
David's recent work has been preoccupied with the past and trying to define why we are where we are now. His horizons have quite literally widened, I think, in the past 2 or 3 years, partly because he's been living abroad quite a lot in the States and in Australia, but also personally. And he's become much more concerned both with the future and with the present, with thinking outside the rather crippling insularity of Englishness, and particularly English middle-classness. And this is, I think, what has taken him on to A Map of the World, which is concerned with picking over the debris of a post-imperial world and looking, if you like, at the legacy of 3 or 4 generations of fervent colonialism.
In the last few weeks, Hare's been working at the National Theatre, where he's directing his new play, A Map of the World.
Now part 2 of the South Bank Show.
Hello. David Hare's new play, A Map of the World, opened at the National Theatre last Thursday. It's typical of Hare's work that the critics should differ widely in their verdicts. Michael Coveney in the Financial Times has called it one of the very best new plays of recent years, while Irving Wardle in the Times said that after the opening scene he lost the play and ceased to care about either its subject or its characters. The play is set in a luxury hotel in Bombay, where, ironically, a UNESCO conference on poverty is taking place. But at the end of the first scene, we realise that what we're seeing is a film being made about events that took place 6 years earlier. Personally, I didn't think it was always clear whether what we were watching was intended to be reality or a filmmaker's distorted version, and this seems to let Hare off the hook when it comes to making any definite statement. James Fenton in this morning's Sunday Times has called this Hare's get-out clause. The political side of the play, properly I think admired by Robert Cushman in The Observer, is what we chose to concentrate on when I spoke to David Hare about A Map of the World a few weeks ago while the play was still in rehearsal. How did you come to write a play set in India?
I'd spent 6 or 7 years largely writing plays about England. And after I'd written plenty, I felt that I had said all I wanted to say, that was the underlining. And I deliberately started travelling around the world because I was determined not to repeat myself and not to go on writing the same play. Now, the result was a drought that I spent some years either writing nothing or throwing away everything that I wrote because I was determined that I should write about a new subject. And I went to America for a long time, I went to Australia, I went to India, and by an act of will, really, I've stopped writing about England.
The title comes from Oscar Wilde's essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Why did you want to ally yourself with that particular essay?
I didn't really. A map of the world has two meanings. It comes from Oscar Wilde's quotation, which is, a map of the world which does not include utopia is not even worth drawing. And that seemed to me true. But the play is also about appropriation. It's about how we only notice those facts that suit us. So that inside our heads, we all carry a map of the world, which is very different from the shape of the real map of the world. And on that map, whatever little bit that suits us, we put in. And the bits that don't suit us, we don't put in.
Are you therefore saying that your play takes more than a title from that, takes a theme from that?
No, it's more that I think what it says is true, and that when you move to third world countries, then you are aware that an idea of an ideal society motivates them. And we've lost that impetus in the West. That's to say that progressive idealism is now totally out of fashion in the West. And I wanted to show that the current fashion for right-wing ideas in England is very, very parochial indeed. It's a period through which this country happens to be passing. And if you go elsewhere in the world, then you will find utopianism still a vital force. So the map of the world is about how do you get hold of this huge imbalance which boggles the imagination between the rich countries and the poor countries. The subject in advance bores people. Before you say anything about aid to the third world, people are bored in advance. Why do you think that is? Because the subject is so enormous that people have no way of grasping it. Just as in the subject of nuclear war, people's minds just curl up and roll over in advance.
People aren't bored by nuclear war. They're very active. There's Greenham Common. That's a completely different thing.
Yeah, but they lack ways of discussing it. They don't have ways. They find it very difficult to find ways of talking about it.
I think that analogy doesn't hold, David. I mean, we can argue about that if you want, but to talk about the third world in the terms we are doing, I go along with it. I think that the evidence from the newspapers and from the way we lead our lives would support you. I don't think the analogy of the nuclear debate obtains. I mean, the papers are full of it. Margaret Thatcher's appointed a minister to rebut the left and so on and so forth. But that debate is going on.
Yes. Yes.
Whereas there is no debate in this country, as you rightly say, about the third world.
Yes.
We feel either helpless about it, hopeless about it, or this terrible word which the English keep using in order to distance themselves from anything important, bored by it.
That's right.
And I would just like to address ourselves to that for a minute. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's because, it's because the subject is so enormous that people feel, distanced by it. That's to say, because they see no way into it. And I wanted to offer a means of discussing it. That's to say, I wanted to try and present the vitality of the point of view of those third world countries that feel themselves to be misrepresented in the English press, who feel that the way the media treat them is a massive conspiracy against them.
You've done something which I admire and I think is very bold in the play. You've given large parts and a large portion of the play to non-English characters, to an Indian writer, Victor Mehta, to an African politician, Bengwe, a diplomat politician, and they have a confrontation about this very point.
Yes. There's a scene in the middle of the first act, which is the heart of the first act, which presents the point of view of those African countries who feel that they're constantly misrepresented in the English press. We in England only ever hear the libertarian point of view. We hear this single, repeated philosophy over and over again, which is that the price of a free press is that it's a bad press. This point you'll read in newspapers, you'll hear it on television, you'll see it argued in magazines over and over, that the West has the right to distort everything that happens in the third world because that right of distortion is a guarantee of freedom. But there is the reverse of that, which is the hurt of those countries in Africa that feel themselves to be constantly misrepresented. And that hurt communicates itself through what Mbengwe has to say in the scene.
It hurts. It begins to hurt that the context of the struggle in Africa is never made clear. It is never explained. Your news agencies report our events, and from a point of view which is eccentric and sensational. All this, day in, day out, we endure. We make no protest. And when we come to this conference in Bombay, we find that UNESCO has invited a particular keynote speaker, a black man himself, though of course, because he is Indian, it is not how he sees it. He considers himself superior to the black man from the bush. A speaker whose reputation is for wit at the expense of others, whose reporting is not positive, so he's considered a hero in the West. He's called a bringer of truths because he seeks to discredit those who struggle. And so, it is true, yes, in the middle of the night, Mr. Andrews and myself, walking to the gateway of India, did say the larger, the greater misrepresentation we can't do nothing about. Those who control the money will control the information. But the lesser one, yes, a stand is possible. And tonight, you distort things in your novels because it is funny to distort, because indeed the surface of things is funny if you do not understand how that surface comes to be, if you do not look underneath. Just as a funeral may be funny to a small boy who sees it passing in the streets and does not know the man who is dead. So also, no doubt, in Africa, it is superficially funny to see us blundering about. But who makes the jokes? The rich nations.
No.
Jokes, Mr. Mehta, are a product of security. If one is secure, one may laugh at others. Even, this is the really telling thing, one may laugh at oneself. I may pretend to be low by joking, by making jokes about myself, which is my way of saying I am so high, I don't have to care. That is the truth. Humor, like everything, is something you buy. Free speech. Buy. But what is this freedom? The luxury of the rich who are sure of what they have.
What would you do? Ban it?
No. I would ask that black men who ascend from their countries do not conspire in the humiliation of those they have left behind.
Are you worried, or were you worried when you undertook this play, that dealing with big ideas, which they are, massive contemporary conflicts, confrontations, notions, drifts of opinion, that the characters would get lost in the welter of ideas that they, as it were, had to carry, had to represent?
Yes, yes. I mean, the difficulty of the play is obviously the balance between these ideas that, as you say, they carry around. But you must remember, it's strange to explain, but it started really as a satire about how people argue. That's how I began. I was aware, just as in this interview, the question that you ask is not quite the question that I answer. A true debate between people is incredibly difficult. Anybody who watches, I'm a great fan of watching Any Questions or watching that ludicrous Question Time, you know, the Robin Day program, because there you see the sort of classic models of English argument, which is nobody actually listens to a word anybody else says. People simply make statements. When they appear to be replying to each other, they always reply off the point. And argument is a series of sort of glancing collisions whereby people don't quite connect one to another. And already, as one person says something, the other person is already thinking of what they're going to say next. They're not actually listening to what the other person is saying. As a television interviewer, you'll be familiar with this problem.
Well, as an interviewer, let me put a double bank on that and come back to the original question. Do you think
but let
that
me,
people get lost?
let me say, so I started out writing a satire about the way in which people find it so hard to argue anywhere near the point. And as soon as you come to a subject like the third world, then at once people go cascading off in all sorts of different directions.
The problem that we have in this particular interview isn't so much a problem of answering, it's the problem of the length of time that the answer can take. So it behoves us to be elliptical in some cases. And the difficulty here is that you have, it seems to me, characterized that satire by using a device inside the play, which people who haven't seen the play, and most people haven't at this stage, will need to know. The play takes place in Bombay about this conference, but actually it is a film which is being made. And so we step back every so often and we say, oh, this is, as it were, only a film that is being made, or this is also a film that's being made. Right. Why was that device, in a sense, to protect yourself, to actually stop yourself, as it were, being accused of being thought too serious, too on the nail?
No, I don't think that at all. That's to say, certainly I wanted to present a prototype of all situations. That's to say, I wanted to say this play is not exclusively about third world issues. It's about the difficulty we have with meaning, the difficulty we have with the truth, that the truth slips away all the time. And so you see the events as they originally were in Bombay, and then you see a series of sincere people trying desperately and failing completely to represent those events. And a part of the play is about fiction itself, that the very act of reporting something involves distorting it. And Victor Mehta is a novelist who is aware of this, and as time goes by, he becomes more and more fastidious about the amount of distortion that fiction involves, that the very reporting of events finally comes to disgust him, because reality itself is so complicated that to attempt to order it at all eventually becomes disgusting to him.
The problem is, though, I would suggest that because actors are representing parts as actors in the play, because they are actors, what weight are we finally to give to what they say?
I never find it's never been a problem. When the play was performed, it's a massively complicated play to read. When it was performed, audiences accepted it. They understand that they're being presented with Bombay in 1976 and what happened then. They're not being presented with the film of it. They're being presented with what actually happened. They understand that. And whereas everybody in advance was nervous of the device, in fact, in playing, it is absolutely clear, because the scenes have their own authority. Once the scenes begin, people accept the scenes. And it doesn't cast doubt in that way. What I wanted to show was a prototype of all situations that everywhere in the world people miss the point. And that's what I'm on about.
The central character, as we mentioned several times, is Victor Mehta, who's a distinguished Indian novelist in your play. Why did you want a distinguished Indian novelist to be at the heart of the play? And does Victor Mehta come from any of the distinguished Indian novelists knocking around the place?
No, but a lot of people find models for him, because there are a great many distinguished Indian novelists.
Well, not many, but there are two or three.
There are some. No, what I wanted, which is important, was that I was aware that close to communist regimes, in countries that are geographically close to communist regimes, then you have some startling and serious critics of those regimes. It's unimaginable in this country, where right-wing thinkers are somewhat puny and silly, that there are no right-wing polemicists of any humanity or scale. It was necessary for him to come from another country, to come from a place where the close experience of communism has created some large figures. I would find a large right-wing figure in England completely implausible. There are no such people. But there are in countries that are close to the communist experience.
And so you chose him because you could get a plausible right-wing figure. That was the first reason.
Yes, and a right-wing figure.
And then why did you decide that he should be a writer, and why did you decide that he should be Indian?
I can't answer those questions. I mean, how do you decide those things? I mean, I only knew that the position of somebody who believes that freedom of speech is an absolute would be best represented by a writer. And I also wanted somebody who was deracinated, somebody who came from one culture and chose to live in another. And I also wanted somebody who, because they had moved to Europe, valued what was best in the West.
And he's not disillusioned, as Mehta says in one of his key speeches about the civilization he'd expected.
Yes.
When he was growing up in his Indian village, and of course compared to the civilization he discovered.
Well, that's one of the
Right.
continuing themes of the play, that immigrants have the highest expectation of the society that they come to. They are deeply disappointed if the society lets them down. People who live in England, who've lived in England for years and years, are blasé about its decline. But the people who care most passionately about it are people who came to it with the highest expectation.
It seems to me that once people become prosperous, they lose the urge to improve themselves. Anyone who comes new to a society, as I did, an immigrant, has his priorities clear. To succeed in that society, to seek practical achievement, to educate his children to the highest level. Yet, somehow, once 1 or 2 generations have established this success, their grandchildren rush the other way, to disown that success, to disown its responsibilities, to seek, by dressing as savages and eating brown rice, to discredit the very civilization their grandfathers worked so hard to create. This seems to me the ultimate cruelty.
Yes.
The ultimate charade, that the young in the West should dare to turn their faces at this time to the Third World and cast a doubt on the value of their own material prosperity. Not content with flaunting its wealth, the West now fashionably pretends that the materialism that has created this wealth is not a good thing. Well, at least give us a chance to find out, say the poor. For God's sake, let us practice this contempt ourselves.
One of the key moments in the play is when Victor Mater, who has criticized third world countries very savagely in his books and wittily, and some of the things that he's reported as saying are very funny about them, he's been asked at this conference to give a keynote address, and the third world countries object to it because they say, this man's criticized us and scorned us, why should we listen to him? He's asked to read a little bit of paper which says, look, I know I'm a fiction writer and fiction tells lies, so it's okay, folks.
Yeah.
And he refuses to read that piece of paper, and that's one of the arguments, one of the several arguments in the play. Why would you say that fictional truth was so important to Mater?
To Mater?
Yeah.
Well, because the thing is that he makes the artist's claim that he's entitled to this truth which is higher than documentary truth. I think it's a very difficult argument, although I myself practice this thing of saying that I am entitled to tell the world, you know, to say what I like about the world. As a writer, I claim this right. I get very angry about censorship, and I've been involved in a lot of arguments about censorship, particularly at the BBC. And so I always stand on a position of I am entitled to say exactly what I like and show the world in my way. However, there's another point of view which says, well, there are people who get hurt by that and get hurt very badly by that. And I attempt to dramatize that. The question, by what right does the fiction writer think that he's entitled to say exactly what he likes?
Yes. And another aspect of the same question, which I think is again well observed, is that Mater looks down on the film that is being made about his life because, conversely, having defended fiction, he thinks that a fiction made about what he's been up to is bound to be debilitated and distorted.
Well, one of the characteristics of writers as they grow older is that they become extremely they become very, very protective of their own positions. That's to say, they become very intolerant. He's shown to be very jealous of other writers. He's shown not to take... Well,
comes in for a
exactly.
hammering.
You know, but Graham Greene is only chosen because he's the person who would be
so good,
most... Exactly. Because he's so good, and he's the person who therefore would be most likely. Yeah. Jealousy is a characteristic of writers. And it's no coincidence.
What? Not only writers.
Not only writers, but jealousy is particularly fierce in writers. And contempt, disdain, these are the characteristics of middle-aged writers.
Victor Mater, the Indian novelist, and the young English journalist Stephen agree to a debate about their respective positions, about their positions with regard to the way the third world is thought of. The prize for this debate is the bedding of a young woman. Why did you decide to have that as the prize? Why did you...
Why was that the trigger?
Yes. Or, and the prize, not only the trigger. Why did they think that it was worthwhile having a debate to decide who went to bed with Peggy?
Well, Peggy's a young American actress who she's a film actress who happens to be in Bombay at the conference. And she's young, she's inexperienced, and she represents that infuriating American tendency that they can't see what all the fuss is about all the time. And then what you also see is a woman doing something incredibly stupid. That's to say, the woman offers her body as a prize in a debate. It's shown in the play to be a wretchedly foolish thing to do, and a thing in which she herself, in the second act, realizes to be foolish. And the play, in part, one of the strands of the play, is about that girl's growing up. But as the play goes on, she grows up, and she realizes that that peculiarly American way of looking at the world is inadequate to the world's problems.
It's rather old-fashioned, isn't it, the jousting for the maiden, I suppose?
Yes.
The young English journalist to whom we've referred several times is a man who thinks that things can be changed, things can be done, whatever the apparent difficulties and obstacles and so on. Could you tell us a bit about him?
One of the characters, one of the two debaters, is a young man who comes to cover the conference in a rather bored way for a leftish English journal. And he has the sort of conventional portmanteau of opinions that young intellectual London has. And he comes both with the easy superiority and the automatic bag of opinions that everybody has. His happen to be of the left. He hasn't much considered them. But as the conference goes on, and as the debate focuses with Mehta, he is forced by the experience of meeting Mbengwe to discover what he actually believes. And in the debate, whereas earlier you've seen him as rather a nervous and facile character, he discovers that he does actually believe in something. And that discovery animates the debate.
You will never understand any struggle unless you take part in it. How easy to condemn this organization as absurd. Of course, I've sat here and sweated and bitched and argued, often with Elaine. I've run screaming from the points of order and the endless I am mandated to ask. But why do you not think that at the center of the verbiage, often only by hazard, but nevertheless at times and unpredictably, crises are averted, aid is directed?
No, I dare say.
Why do you not imagine that if you stopped distancing yourself, if you got rid of your wretched fastidiousness, you could not lend yourself for once not to objection, but to getting something done? Oh, no. It's too hard. Never. The risk of failure too great. Like so many clever men, you move steadily to the right. Further, distancing, always distancing yourself. Building yourself a bunker into which only the odd woman is occasionally allowed. Disowning your former ideals.
Oh, you know nothing.
Attacking those who still have those ideals with a ferocity which is way out of proportion to their crime.
No!
Yes, well, move. Move to the right if you wish to. Join the shabby crew if you want to. Go in the way people do. But at least, spare us the books. Spare us the Stations of the Cross, the public announcements. Do it in private.
Given the different things you're trying to do in this play, any single conclusion would seem to me to be hard to arrive at. Did you have difficulties with finding an ending, and what ending did you finally decide on?
Yes, no, I had great difficulty finding an ending, and I went into rehearsal in Australia without the right ending, and I knew I didn't have an ending. And I have this absurd faith that if you trust the material, and if you do things in a reasonably decent way, then material will resolve itself. I could find no end to Mehta's story. And it was only in the final days of rehearsal in Australia, and partly through improvisation with the actors, that 4 days before we were to open in Adelaide, I found the ending of the play. And the ending completely satisfies me, that you see Mehta, the novelist, as a man who has lost faith in his ability to change the world. Earlier in the play, he's a moralist, a right-wing moralist, but he is a moralist nevertheless. And he, in the moralist's way, is saying things should be done and ordered in this particular way. The world should be like this, he says. As the play goes on, he loses that faith. And at the end, he says of the faith that we may change things, he says, lose that, lose everything. And you're left in no doubt that the loss of that faith is the loss of what actually makes you a human being. That the belief that you can, by what you say or do, have an impact on the world, change the world. That belief is what distinguishes us here. And it's everything. And the feeling that that belief is everything makes, I hope, the end of the play uplifting.
David Hare's new play, A Map of the World, opened last week at the National Theatre. This autumn, ITV will be showing a television film written by Hare. It deals with the hurried evacuation of the American presence in Vietnam, and it's called Saigon. Next week on the South Bank Show, a profile of the choreographer Agnes de Mille, who created the dances in Oklahoma, Carousel and Paint Your Wagon. Good night.